When my husband died, my parents didn't show up for me until they found out how much money he left behind. This is the story of Rachel Whitmore, a grieving widow and mother who's forced to confront not just loss, but the ugly truth about her own family. Betrayed in her darkest hour, she finds herself at the center of a quiet war over inheritance, loyalty, and dignity. But what her parents didn't expect was her daughter. If you've ever been hurt by the people who should have protected you most, this story is for you. Stay with us. It's time to expose the price of conditional love. The phone didn't even ring twice before my mother picked up. "We're at Sophie's birthday dinner right now. Can this wait until tomorrow?" Her voice was light, distracted, backgrounded by clinking glasses and the rise and fall of party chatter. I was standing in the kitchen, Kevin's blood still on the sleeve of my blouse, the shock still pounding like a drum behind my ribs. "He's dead, Mom." My voice cracked. "Kevin died this morning, at work. It was a heart attack." There was a pause, no gasp, no shattered silence, just a beat of mild confusion. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Maybe there's been a mistake. I mean, he was young, wasn't he?" I sank slowly to the floor, my back against the cold cabinet door, phone pressed to my ear. "I saw his body, Mom." Another beat. Then, again, her voice returned, still barely tinged with the appropriate grief. "Oh, that's terrible, sweetie. I'm so sorry. But it's Sophie's 40th and everyone's here. The caterers, the cake, the whole thing. Can you manage tonight and we'll come by tomorrow when things settle down?" I didn't answer. I just stared at the kitchen floor, at the shattered coffee mug I had dropped hours earlier when Amanda called to say Kevin had collapsed in the conference room. I had driven through the city like a madwoman, praying out loud to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. But I was too late. 11:23 a.m., they said. He was gone. I heard my father's voice in the background. Then he came on the line. "Rachel," he said, his tone somber but measured. "That's awful news. Was Kevin's life insurance up to date? You should call the firm first thing in the morning and get the paperwork moving." Not, "We'll come right over." Not, "What do you need?" Just numbers, just logistics. That night, Lily and I sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in one of Kevin's flannel shirts. She had fallen asleep mid-sentence, a question about whether Daddy would still come to her art show tonight, lingering on her lips. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't even lie. The apartment, once filled with Kevin's laughter and the hume of his late-night financial podcasts, had fallen into an eerie silence. I walked into the bathroom, shut the door softly behind me, and sank to the floor. My body shook with sobs, ugly, broken sobs that cracked my chest open and echoed against the tile. I needed my mother. Or at least, I had thought I would. Instead, I got a voicemail from her later that night. "Thinking of you, honey. Call when you feel up to it." The next morning, I poured Lily's cereal in a haze, the box nearly toppling out of my hand. She sat across from me, legs swinging in her chair, her eyes swollen and red but dry. "Grandma didn't come," she said simply, without accusation, only observation. "No," I said, brushing her hair from her face. "She didn't." Lily nodded slowly, as if she had expected nothing else. That evening, Kevin's colleague Brian came by with a lasagna and a framed photo of their team at the last company retreat. "He loved you both so damn much," he said, gripping my shoulder too tightly. Friends and strangers showed up, texted, called. My own family stayed silent. And that's when it began to form inside me. Not rage, not yet, but the slow, awful recognition of something worse. I wasn't just grieving my husband. I was grieving the idea of a family I never really had. Kevin's funeral was set for Saturday. The funeral home director called me 2 days after his death, asking if I preferred cremation or burial, what songs I'd like for the service, and whether Kevin had a favorite suit. I stood in the living room clutching the receiver, staring at the spot where his shoes still waited by the door. I couldn't answer. I didn't know if he had a favorite suit. I only knew which shirt he liked to wear when he coached Lily's soccer games and which cologne made her giggle and say he smelled like the forest after rain. The decisions came like bullets. I had to choose a casket, approve a program, notify the firm, answer insurance emails. The only thing I didn't have to think about was who'd be helping. Because no one offered. Not my parents, not Sophie. They called once to ask what time the service was and whether black was still traditional or if this was going to be one of those celebration of life things. Kevin's brother Marcus flew in from Japan. He arrived late Friday night, jet-lagged and silent. He walked into our apartment and didn't say a word at first, just hugged me so tightly my knees nearly buckled. Then he dropped to the floor beside Lily, who had fallen asleep on the couch in one of Kevin's cardigans, and whispered, "I'm here, kiddo. I got you." He sat with her the entire service. Saturday morning dawned painfully beautiful. One of those early autumn days where light looks like it's trying too hard to be gentle. Lily insisted on wearing her blue dress, the one Kevin always called her princess dress. I braided her hair the way he used to, my fingers trembling with every twist. Kevin's co-workers arrived early, solemn and dark-suited. Many of them wept openly. They shared stories I'd never heard. About his ridiculous spreadsheets for team lunches. His habit of hiding handwritten notes in people's desk drawers when they had a tough day. My parents were late. They texted 20 minutes before the service. Traffic, save us seats. They walked in just as the music started, Sophie whispering complaints about the A/C being too high, my father adjusting his Rolex before sitting. My mother gave me a fleeting hug that smelled of strong perfume and plastic sympathy. I stood at the podium alone, staring at the sea of faces. Some red-eyed and swollen, some blank and cold. Then I looked at Lily, so small and still in the front row, her hands folded tightly in Marcus's. That's when the words came. I spoke of Kevin's laugh, his unwavering kindness, his silly hatred for cilantro, the way he'd stayed up watching YouTube tutorials on soccer just to impress a 7-year-old. I spoke of his integrity, his quiet brilliance, the way he always chose us, even when it meant less sleep, less time, less ambition. I said the thing that still scorched my throat to speak. That we had been happy, really deeply happy. When I stepped down, my mother was checking her phone. My father had his hand on my shoulder before I sat. He must have had a strong policy, he murmured. You'll be all right now. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because I knew in that moment, more clearly than anything else, that whatever piece I had left was about to be stolen, piece by piece, by the very people who were supposed to protect it, and that the real mourning hadn't even started yet. 2 weeks after the funeral, the doorbell rang. I was at the kitchen table, sorting through health insurance paperwork with the kind of mechanical precision that grief demands. Lily was finally back at school, her teachers sending kind, cautious updates each day, as if she might break under a wrong word. When I peeked through the peephole, my heart stopped. It was them. My parents stood on the porch like a portrait. My father straightened the collar of his golf shirt. My mother caught her reflection in her compact mirror and dabbed at non-existent smudges. I hesitated. They hadn't visited since the day of the funeral. Texts had been sparse, hollow, thinking of you, hope you're doing okay. Now they were here, unannounced. I opened the door. We thought we'd check in, my mother said, sweeping into the foyer before I could answer. See how you and Lily are holding up? Her voice had a rehearsed gentleness too soft to trust. She's at school, I replied, stepping aside. What's this about? My father set his briefcase-sized leather bag on the coffee table and sat. My mother chose the armchair like she owned it. I served coffee. Out of habit, Even as I set the mugs down, I knew this wasn't a sympathy visit. This was a meeting. My father cleared his throat the same way he used to before discussing tax returns or insurance deductibles. Rachel, your mother and I have been reviewing some things. Now that you're adjusting to life without Kevin, we thought it was time to talk. Practically, I echoed. He nodded. You know how healthcare costs are, and with the market being unpredictable, our retirement fund has taken some hits. It hung in the air like smoke. I said nothing. My mother offered a sympathetic shrug as if to say, "This is just the reality of aging. Surely you understand." So, I asked, "We're simply suggesting a gesture of family support. Given Kevin's success and the generous life insurance policy, you're in a position to help." He leaned back, fingers steepled. 50% would be reasonable. It didn't register at first. I blinked. Excuse me? Half? He repeated. It secures our retirement. You and Lily will still have more than enough, and we think it's fair considering all the support we've given you. Tuition, your first house. You mean the down payment you also called a loan for 10 years? We're not here to argue semantics, he said calmly. The silence that followed was deep and clean, like the moment before an avalanche. And then I heard the soft tap of Lily's shoes. She stood at the foot of the stairs, still in her school uniform, clutching a manila envelope. "Grandpa," she said, "did you come to talk about Daddy's money?" My parents both froze. "I have something for you." She crossed the room and placed the envelope on the table in front of my father. "It's a bill." "A bill?" he asked, eyebrows drawing together. "For love," Lily said simply. She turned and walked back upstairs. My hands trembled as I reached for the envelope. I already knew what was inside. She had shown me the night before, her handwriting uneven but deliberate. At the top, it read, "Invoice for being real grandparents." Each line listed acts they hadn't done. Being there when Daddy died, $0, 0 cents. Not provided. Helping Mommy when she was sad, $0, 0 cents not provided. Hugging me when I cried, $0, 0 cents not provided. At the bottom, total, $0, 0 cents earned. I didn't say a word. I just placed the invoice in my father's lap, then stood. "Conversation's over," I said quietly. "You can show yourselves out." They didn't leave right away. My father sat frozen, eyes fixed on the invoice in his lap like it might combust. My mother looked away, blinking fast. Her perfectly manicured hands clutched the armrest like she needed to steady herself. "This is unnecessary," my father said finally. "She's a child. She doesn't understand how the world works." "She understands more than you think," I replied, my voice low, steady. My mother stood, smoothing the front of her blouse. "We raised you, Rachel. We gave you everything. This hostility is shocking. You didn't come when I called. You didn't hold your granddaughter when she collapsed into sobs. You didn't ask how I was sleeping, if we had enough food, how I was handling the logistics of a funeral by myself. You only came when you smelled money." My father stood slowly, folding the invoice and tucking it into his inner jacket pocket like evidence to be presented later. "We're your family," he said, as if that was supposed to excuse it all. "We deserve respect." "Respect is earned," I said, my hands clenched at my sides. "You haven't earned it." "We'll be in touch," he said coldly. My mother hesitated at the door, looking at me the way one might study a painting. Nostalgic, confused, disappointed. It didn't look like she remembered. "She's just a little girl, Rachel. Don't put ideas in her head. She drew those ideas all on her own." They left without another word. The door clicked shut behind them, too soft to match the weight it carried. I stood there for a long time. The quiet in the house after their departure wasn't peaceful. It was electric, the air still charged with the wreckage of what had just unfolded. Upstairs, I heard Lily's door close gently. She had listened to every word. That night, after dinner, I sat at the edge of her bed. She looked at me with those same blue eyes Kevin had, bright but quietly observant. "Did I do the wrong thing?" she asked. "No, baby." I reached for her hand. "You did something brave, but they're still Grandma and Grandpa. They are. And sometimes people who are supposed to love us hurt us instead." She was quiet for a while, then, "Daddy wouldn't have let them talk to you like that." "No, he wouldn't." She looked over at her bookshelf. "Do you think Daddy would be mad that I gave him the bill?" I shook my head. "I think Daddy would be proud of you. I think he'd say you told the truth in the clearest way anyone ever has." Lily nodded slowly, then whispered, "I miss him." "I do too." After she fell asleep, I went back downstairs. On the coffee table, the coffee mugs were still half full. I poured them out and rinsed them in the sink. As the water ran, I imagined Kevin standing behind me, arms around my waist, the way he used to do when I cooked breakfast. "You were always too kind," he once said, "but kindness doesn't mean letting people walk over you." I dried the mugs, turned off the kitchen light, and picked up the envelope Lily had made. A second copy, in her handwriting, still sat on the counter. She had drawn a tiny heart in the corner, next to the words, "Real love is shown, not asked for." The next morning, I scanned the page and saved it to my desktop. I named the file, "Evidence for When They Try Again." Because I knew they would, and this time I'd be ready. It started with the filing cabinet, not the grief. That had already rooted itself in every corner of my chest. Not the fear, either, that had come later once the numbness wore off. No, what began with the cabinet was clarity. Kevin had always been meticulous. He'd color-coded our budget spreadsheets, labeled our pantry shelves, and set calendar reminders for things I'd forget. But the filing cabinet in his office, that was his fortress. 4 drawers, precisely tabbed files, everything in its place. I hadn't opened it since the funeral. That morning, with Lily at school and silence thick in the air, I pulled the top drawer open and started searching for his will. I didn't expect to find an envelope with my name on it. The handwriting stopped me cold. It was his, no doubt. I traced each letter with my thumb before I slid my finger under the flap. My heart thudded in my ears. Inside was a single sheet of paper, dated 3 months before he died. "My dearest Rachel," it began. "If you're reading this, it means the doctor was right, and I'm sorry I kept it from you." I sat down hard on the carpet, the letter trembling in my hands. "I didn't want to worry you. I know how scared you were during the miscarriages, the pregnancy with Lily, all of it. Tests, the shortness of breath. But I knew, and I prepared. The will is updated. You're the sole beneficiary of everything, life insurance, retirement, investments." He had known. He had seen what I didn't. He had prepared for the day he might not come home. The letter continued with details, clear, crisp, practical, as if he were giving me instructions for assembling Lily's soccer net again. There was one paragraph, though, that hit like a thunderclap. "Your father approached me twice about investments, which, let's be honest, were just roundabout requests for money. I declined politely, but I could see it in his eyes. He thought if I was gone, he'd have access to you. That's why I set up a trust just for Lily. No one can touch it, not even you, until she turns 25, except for educational costs. Don't let anyone try to change that. It's hers. It's sacred." I read that paragraph over and over until the words blurred. Kevin had protected us even after death. He had seen what I refused to. My father's manipulation hadn't started with the funeral. It had been brewing long before. I folded the letter with trembling hands and placed it back in the envelope. Then I called Thomas Blake. Kevin's longtime friend and our estate lawyer, Thomas, was the kind of man who spoke in measured tones and kept his desk cleaner than a surgery table. He didn't sound surprised when I told him about the letter. "Kevin mentioned it to me," Thomas said. "He was concerned but didn't want to upset you." "He knew," I said quietly. "Yes," Thomas replied. "And he made sure Lily would be protected. The trust is airtight. No one can challenge it. Not your parents, not any extended family." I stared at the floor, my throat tight. "Even if they try, they won't get far," he said. "But if they do, we'll be ready." After we hung up, I opened my laptop and created a folder titled The Reckoning Plan. I scanned Kevin's letter and saved it inside, along with Lily's invoice. I wasn't sure what I'd need in the weeks to come, but I knew the time for silence had passed, and I would not let Kevin's foresight go to waste. That night, I waited until Lily was asleep before calling Marcus. His voice came through, a little staticky from Japan, but warm, always warm. "I found a letter from Kevin," I said quietly. There was a pause, just long enough to feel the weight of that sentence. "He wrote it a few months before he died," I continued. "He knew something was wrong. He didn't tell me, but he prepared everything. He made sure we'd be okay." Marcus exhaled slowly. "That sounds like him." "He also knew about my father," I added. "Apparently, Dad approached him twice asking for money. Kevin set up a trust for Lily because of it, locked tight, just for her. Not even I can touch it unless it's for her education." "He told me about that," Marcus said. "When Lily was born, he made me promise if anything ever to happen to him, I'd be there for you both, and I meant it, Rachel." My chest tightened. "I know. I'm coming back," he said. "I'm taking a leave next semester. I can't sit an ocean away while this is happening." Tears welled unexpectedly. "You don't have to upend your life." "I want to. Kevin was my brother. You and Lily, you're my family now." After we hung up, I sat alone in the quiet hum of the kitchen. The envelope lay beside me on the table, its corners slightly worn from rereading. I pulled out my notebook and began writing not a plan this time, but a record of every call, every text, every subtle threat or guilt-laced message from my parents since the funeral. Dates, times, tone. I documented it all. The next morning, I brought the letter to Tomas's office. It was a small brick building in downtown Evanston, a quiet place with big windows and polished wood. Tomas scanned the letter slowly, nodding. "This reinforces everything Kevin already arranged," he said. "But having his words in writing, it's powerful. And if they try to challenge anything, this letter is your shield." "Do you think they will?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. "People don't show up unannounced to ask for half a life insurance policy unless they believe they're entitled to something." "They've always believed that," I said bitterly, "even when I was a kid. Sophie was the artist, the one with potential. I was the one who held things together, quiet, responsible, invisible." Thomas tapped the envelope gently. "Kevin saw you. And he trusted you with this." Before I left, he handed me a printed copy of the trust documents and a clean scan of the letter, now notarized. "Keep them safe," he said. "And if your father contacts you again, don't respond. Forward everything to me." I nodded, folding the documents into my bag like weapons. Later that afternoon, I sat in the living room with Lily as she finished her math homework. She looked up suddenly and asked, "Mom, do people stop being family when they hurt you?" I hesitated. "Sometimes," I said. "Sometimes being related isn't enough." She looked thoughtful, then turned back to her paper. "Then I'm glad Daddy picked our family." That night I printed a small label and stuck it to the outside of the folder on my computer. Family isn't blood, it's protection. And then beneath that, I wrote, he trusted me to finish what he started. And I would. The voicemail came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in my father's clipped, performative tone, like he was leaving a message for his stockbroker. This concerns the whole family, Rachel. Be at the house Sunday at 2. Bring Lily. He didn't ask. He summoned. I played it twice before deleting it. The second time Lily was in the room, she didn't say anything, but I saw her shoulders stiffen. She looked at me, that quiet, searching look she'd inherited from Kevin. Do we have to go? We don't have to do anything, I said. But maybe it's time to face them properly. She nodded. Then I want to come. I have an idea. That night she worked silently in her room, pencils and papers scattered across her desk like a battlefield. When I peeked in, she quickly closed her notebook. Not yet, she said with a little smile. You'll see it Sunday. Sunday morning came cold and gray. I wore the black wool coat Kevin had given me for Christmas 3 years ago. The last one before his heart started whispering threats he didn't tell me about. Lily dressed herself in a navy sweater dress and braided her own hair, refusing help. As we pulled into the driveway of my childhood home in Oakbrook, the pit in my stomach churned. The house was exactly as I remembered. White brick, polished windows, a 2-green lawn that never fit with the seasons. There were too many cars parked out front, more than just my parents. I recognized my Aunt Rita's burgundy Volvo, Uncle Terry's battered Ford, and Barbara's pristine Prius. They'd called in reinforcements, as if shame worked better in groups. The door opened before I knocked. My mother stood there in a crisp ivory blouse and pearl earrings, her expression composed. Rachel? Lily? Come, everyone's waiting. The house smelled like cinnamon candles and something vaguely citrus, like they'd tried to sanitize the air. We walked into the living room, where the furniture had been rearranged to mimic a courtroom. My father sat in his recliner like a presiding judge. Sophie perched on the arm of the couch, scrolling through her phone. The others, the aunts and uncles, looked various shades of uneasy, their eyes flicking between me and my father like spectators unsure which side to root for. Thank you for coming, my father said. We have important matters to discuss. I'm not staying long, I said, taking a seat with Lily beside me. And anything you have to say, you can say in front of her. She's a child, my mother said quickly. This isn't appropriate. If it's not appropriate for her to hear, I cut in, then it's not appropriate to ask. There was a pause, and then my father leaned forward, folding his hands. As you know, your mother and I are approaching retirement. Medical expenses, inflation, market volatility, it's all getting worse, and you're in a better position now, thanks to Kevin. Sophie's smile twitched into something smug. My father continued, We've put together a fair proposal. 50% of the life insurance proceeds to us, and 15% to your sister, who's been struggling with her art business. That still leaves plenty for you and Lily. He reached into a leather folder and slid a printed document across the coffee table toward me, neatly formatted, bold numbers, percentages, signatures, blank. I see you've done your math, I said. We've done what's fair, he replied, as if that settled everything. I didn't touch the document. I looked at Lily instead. She nodded, barely perceptible, and stood up. I have something to say, she said clearly. All heads turned. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. My little girl, standing in the middle of that cold, staged living room, was the most real thing in it. Lily reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded crisply into thirds. She walked past my mother, past the leather folder with its tidy betrayal, and placed the paper directly into my father's lap. He blinked down at it. At the top, in Lily's careful handwriting, were the words, Bill for real love and support. The room went silent. He read the lines aloud, his voice flat but faltering. Being there when Daddy died, $0, 0 cents, not provided. Helping Mommy when she was sad, $0, 0 cents, not provided. Hugging me when I cried, $0, 0 cents, not provided. Being real grandparents, priceless, not paid. A small heart was drawn at the bottom corner, underneath the word total. Total, $0, 0 cents, earned. My mother made a strange, guttural sound, half gasp, half sob. Her fingers fluttered to her mouth as if trying to push the moment back. Inside, Sophie looked up from her phone, for once completely speechless. Lily turned to face the room. Daddy always told me that when people show you who they really are, you should believe them. He said, family isn't who says they love you, it's who actually shows up. Her voice wobbled just once, but she steadied herself. You didn't come when Daddy died, you didn't help Mom, you didn't ask if I was okay, but now you want his money? She turned back to me, her eyes blazing with something far older than her 9 years. Can we go now, Mom? I stood slowly. Yes, we can. We raised you, my father snapped as I turned to the door. You owe us. I looked at him, and for the first time in my life I saw him clearly, not as my father, not as the man who paid tuition or attended dance recitals half-heartedly, but as someone who had always believed love was a transaction. And now, the bill had come due. I don't owe you anything, I said. Respect is earned, and you've earned none. We're your parents, my mother said, her voice cracking. We made sacrifices for you. So did Kevin, I replied, but he never once used it to manipulate us. Behind me, Lily reached for my hand. If you want a relationship with us, I added, it starts with accountability. Not demands, not guilt, not financial spreadsheets, disguised as love. We walked to the door. My father's voice followed us like a cold gust. Don't expect us to come running when you need help someday. I didn't turn around. You didn't come running when I needed you the most. Outside, the air was crisp. Lily's grip tightened as we walked down the driveway, past the cars of people who had watched but said nothing. At the curb, she looked up at me. Did I do okay? I knelt beside her. You were braver than I've ever been. She looked thoughtful, then whispered, I think Daddy helped me. I smiled through the sting in my throat. I think he did too. As I started the car, I glanced back one last time at the house I once called home. Inside, I imagined the silence, the sting of being called out by a child, the paper invoice now a mirror they couldn't look away from. Some walls don't fall with hammers. Sometimes all it takes is the truth. Spoken softly, folded on a single sheet of paper, and left behind. The first letter came 3 days later. Not handwritten, not warm, printed on heavy ivory cardstock, embossed with my father's business logo like it was a quarterly shareholder update. The envelope was sealed with his initials in gold, his version of dignity, and delivered via courier, not post. Presentation had always been his preferred weapon. It was addressed to both me and Lily. Inside, a single page, sharply worded and devoid of emotion. Unless a reasonable financial arrangement can be reached, we will be forced to reconsider our relationship with you and your daughter entirely. Forced. Reconsider. It was a threat, dressed in etiquette. I read it 3 times, then placed it gently on the kitchen counter beside Lily's half-finished cereal bowl. I didn't want to alarm her. Not yet. She was watching cartoons with her feet tucked under the blanket Kevin used to hog every winter. I forwarded a photo of the letter to Thomas and typed a short message. They've gone from subtle guilt to formal threats. Your move. He responded within the hour, already drafting a response. They have no legal ground, but if they escalate, we'll file for a cease and desist. Keep everything they send. I slid the letter into a clear plastic folder marked Harassment Phase 2. That weekend, they tried a new tactic. My mother showed up at Lily's school. The secretary called me immediately, her voice tight. "There's a woman here, says she's your mother. She tried to leave a gift with Lily during pickup." I was at work. I dropped everything and drove to the school in silence, my hands clenched on the steering wheel. By the time I arrived, the principal had already ushered her outside. She was standing near the flagpole, coat buttoned to the neck, clutching a small pink gift bag. I parked and walked over slowly. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with fury. "You can't come here," I said without greeting. She blinked. Her eyes looked tired for the first time in weeks. I just wanted to give her something. "A birthday is coming soon, isn't it?" "It's not for another month," she hesitated. I thought maybe she'd want to see us. Maybe we could start again. "Not like this." Her lip trembled. "You're turning everyone against us." "No," I said. "Your own actions did that. You came to my home, asking for half of what Kevin left for Lily. You brought an army to guilt me in front of extended family, and now you show up at her school, unannounced, pretending it's about birthdays?" I stepped closer, my voice low. "This is your final warning, Bede. Do not come near her again unless invited." Her face crumpled, but I didn't soften. "You're our daughter," she said, reaching for something that might have once mattered. "You lost the right to say that the day you put a party ahead of my grief." She didn't reply, just stood there, wind tugging at the hem of her coat, still holding the gift bag. I walked away. Later that night, Lily asked why Grandma had come to her school. I didn't lie. "She wanted to give you a gift." "Oh," Lily said. Then, after a pause, "Did she ask about Daddy?" "No," I admitted. "Then I don't want the gift." I smiled, even as something broke inside me. Because she understood. And that meant we were going to be okay. By the end of the week, a second letter arrived. This one, less formal, handwritten in my mother's looping cursive, the kind she used to sign birthday cards. No embossed seal this time. No legal threats. Just a note laced with nostalgic guilt. "We've made mistakes, but we're still your parents. Family shouldn't be so quick to cut each other out. Can't we start fresh? For Lily's sake." There was a photo tucked inside. It was from a Thanksgiving long ago. Kevin had his arm around me, Lily in his lap. Barely 2 years old and covered in mashed potatoes. My father was behind us, smiling. My mother had her hands on Sophie's shoulders. The caption read, "Back when things were good." I stared at it for a long time. Back when things were good? Even then, they'd left the table early to take Sophie to her art showcase. Kevin had stayed behind, cleaning up while I put Lily down for a nap. That picture didn't capture warmth. It captured performance. I put the letter in the same folder as the first. Beneath the plastic, it sat between two versions of my parents, the cold strategists and the guilted historians. I didn't reply. Instead, I called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. "I've booked the flight," he said before I could speak. "I'll be back in 3 days." "I didn't ask you to," I said, though I didn't mean it. "I know. But Kevin would have wanted me there." He always said that with a steady calm that felt like a safety net. And it was true. Kevin had trusted Marcus to be his anchor if everything fell apart. It had. And Marcus was keeping his promise. When he arrived, Lily ran into his arms like she had been holding her breath for weeks. He brought her a chess set carved from sandalwood and a small notebook labeled "Secrets I'll Tell You First." She took both like they were treasure. That weekend, we sat at the kitchen table and updated Thomas on everything. Marcus listened silently as I read the letters aloud, his eyes narrowing at the details. "They're pivoting," he said. "First it was financial threats. Now they're fishing for pity. I don't trust it. You shouldn't, Marcus said. But maybe there's something else we can do. He reached into his bag and pulled out a slim black folder. I started gathering character references from Kevin's colleagues, old professors, the families he helped through financial coaching. If this ever goes legal, even if it's just public opinion, you're not alone. I blinked, surprised. You've been building a case. I've been watching your back, he said. Same thing. That night, after Lily went to bed, Marcus and I sat on the balcony watching the quiet streets of Evanston below. Autumn had set in fully. The air was sharp. Trees were shedding everything they no longer needed. I envied them. I think I'm done trying to fix this, I said. You mean with your parents? I nodded. I kept hoping they'd change, that grief would humble them, but it didn't. It sharpened their greed. Sometimes, he said gently, family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shares your burden. I looked over at him and thought, not for the first time, how lucky Kevin was to have a brother like Marcus, and how lucky Lily was that he was still here. Inside, the lights were low. Lily's chessboard sat on the table. Mid-game, a knight position just behind the queen. Sometimes you have to sacrifice a piece to protect the one that matters most. I wasn't sacrificing anything else for the sake of people who'd already proven they'd never protect us. 1 year after Kevin's death, the house was quiet, but not empty. Lily sat at the dining table, carefully arranging photos in a leather-bound album, her brow furrowed in deep concentration, tongue poking slightly from the corner of her mouth as she tried to align a picture of Kevin tossing her in the air during a beach vacation. Marcus stood at the stove, humming an old Beatles tune, stirring chili with the same gentleness he used when teaching her chess. Diana and Robert, Kevin's parents, were in the backyard stringing up fairy lights between the trees. The air smelt like baked cornbread and fall. We were preparing for the memorial. Not the kind with pews or programs, but the kind Kevin would have loved. Stories around a backyard fire. Lily's favorite mac and cheese. The people who mattered. It had been my idea to hold it on the anniversary of his death, to give the grief a day. Just one. So it wouldn't creep into every corner of the year. There were no invitations sent to my side of the family, not out of spite, out of peace. But peace, it turned out, was ambitious. Because 2 days before the gathering, another envelope arrived. This one bore no seal, no threats, just handwriting I hadn't seen in months, familiar, uncertain. Inside, a letter. Dear Rachel and Lily, it began. We've spent the last year thinking, trying to understand where things went wrong, not just after Kevin died, but long before. We can't ask you to forget, but we hope one day you'll let us show you that we can do better. It was signed by both of my parents. I read it 3 times, then handed it silently to Marcus. He read it once and gave no immediate reaction, just folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. It's different, I said finally. Not demanding, not manipulative. Maybe real? He nodded. Maybe. Lily found it that night. She saw the envelope and picked it up gently. Is this from them? She asked. Yes. She looked at it like she was deciding whether to open a window on a cold day. Do they still want money? No, I said. This time, they're asking for a chance. She sat with that for a moment. Then, I think Daddy would want us to listen, at least once. So, we did. We agreed to meet them not at the house, not at ours, but at Lily's favorite ice cream shop, downtown. Neutral ground, public, safe. When we arrived, they were already there. My mother looked smaller than I remembered, her cardigan loose around the shoulders. My father stood as we approached, unsure whether to hug us or stay seated. For once, he didn't assume. The conversation was stiff, guarded. They asked Lily about school, her science fair, the chess tournament she was entering. They didn't mention Kevin. They didn't ask about the money. They didn't speak of the letters or the meeting or the invoice. And maybe that restraint was the first real gesture of remorse I'd seen from either of them. When we left, Lily held a small paper bag with a single scoop of mint chocolate chip and a soft expression on her face. "Maybe we can try again," she said. "Maybe," I said, watching my parents through the shop window as they quietly watched us go. But only if they keep showing up the right way. The day of the gathering arrived with a soft golden light that filtered through the trees like a benediction. Kevin would have called it good barbecue weather. Friends began arriving around 2. Amanda brought Kevin's favorite bourbon bread pudding. A couple from his financial literacy class came bearing a framed photo from one of their first community workshops. Robert manned the grill with quiet purpose. Diana organized the food table, stopping occasionally to wipe away tears when she thought no one was looking. Lily floated among the guests like a small, determined hostess. She carried the photo album she'd been working on all week, showing people the pages she had labeled with stickers. Me and Daddy at the lake, Daddy's pancake faces, Daddy jokes. Everyone smiled, some laughed, a few cried quietly. It wasn't somber. It was tender. Midway through, Lily stood up on the low garden wall and tapped a spoon against her juice glass. "I want to share something," she said, her voice carrying easily in the soft hush that followed. Everyone turned. She opened a notebook and read aloud, her words clear, careful, and unmistakably hers. "My daddy said being strong doesn't mean not crying. It means knowing when to fight and when to walk away. He also said love is something you do, not just something you say. That's why we need a memory book, so we can keep doing love, even though he's not here to say it." Silence fell like reverence. Then a soft wave of applause. I wasn't sure when I started crying, but Marcus put a hand on my shoulder and didn't let go. That evening, after the last guests had gone, we sat in the backyard, just the 5 of us. Me, Lily, Marcus, Deanna, and Robert. The string lights glowed overhead. The fire pit had burned down to soft embers. Lily leaned her head against my arm. "Do you think Daddy saw today?" "I think he never missed a thing." She smiled, small and sleepy. "Then I hope he saw that part where everyone laughed at his cilantro joke." Robert chuckled. He hated cilantro with religious conviction. We stayed out until the air turned cool and Lily's eyelids drooped. As Marcus carried her inside, Diana lingered beside me. "Your parents," she said gently. "Will they ever come to something like this?" "Maybe," I said, "if they earn it." She nodded, understanding that wasn't bitterness, just truth. Inside, I tucked Lily into bed. Her notebook and the photo album were by her pillow. As I turned off the light, she whispered, "Mom?" "Yes, baby." "I think the envelope I gave Grandpa helped." I paused at the doorway. "What makes you say that?" "They're different now." "A little." I walked back to her side, brushed her hair from her forehead. "Maybe they are." She reached for my hand. "Daddy said sometimes people have to see the truth to change. Maybe that's what I showed them." I kissed her forehead. "Your daddy was right." That night, I sat alone at the dining table, flipping through the album Lily had made. It was messy and perfect, filled with sticky notes and hand-drawn stars. On the final page was a drawing, crayon bold and proud, of our little family. Me, Lily, Kevin, and Marcus, holding our hands. Underneath, in block letters, we kept going. Together. I closed the album, heart full. It wasn't the life we planned, but it was becoming something beautiful, built on truth, held together by love earned, not demanded, and this time, on our terms. Thank you for joining us on this deeply personal journey. If this story resonated with you, it's likely because you've known what it feels like to be let down by those who were supposed to love you most, to be abandoned in grief, to be treated like a transaction, not a human being. But this story wasn't just about betrayal. It was about truth, about drawing boundaries, standing tall in the face of manipulation, and choosing dignity over silence. It was about protecting the ones we love, even when it means walking away from the people we thought we couldn't live without. To every viewer who has had to rebuild their life from the ashes of a broken family, we see you, we honor your courage, and we hope this story reminds you that your worth is not measured by how much you give to those who only take. Real love is shown in actions, not demands. And healing isn't about pretending the hurt never happened. It's about writing a new chapter with people who actually show up. If you found strength in this story, please share it. Leave a comment about your own journey. Let someone else know they're not alone. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about justice, healing, and truth, because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't about getting even. It's about getting free. From our hearts to yours, thank you for watching. Stay brave, stay kind, and never forget, family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by who stands beside you when it matters most.